Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to Imperial Armour. As we're sticking with the poor mortals of the 41st millennium for another week, but this time we are heading to the completely opposite side of the spectrum. Last Friday we covered the planetary defense forces, the most undervalued, most overlooked, and under-equipped of all the God Emperor's forces, whereas today we are looking at the pride and joy of the heaviest and most favoured of Imperial Guard armoured regiments, the Baneblade, which, weighing in excess of 300 tons and measuring 13 plus meters long and 8 meters wide, is the heaviest tracked vehicle in relatively common usage with the forces of the Imperium of Man. And such a beast, of course, requires quite the crew as well, with a standard complement of 10 crew members, and on certain variants, even more than that, as the Baneblade is covered in secondary and primary weaponry. Where normal tanks would have a coaxial machine gun next to the main cannon, the Baneblade has an autocannon. Where a normal tank might have a hull-mounted heavy machine gun, the Baneblade has a demolisher cannon. The closest thing the Baneblade gets to a traditional, hull-mounted light weapon is a twin-linked heavy bolter in its own armoured cupola on the forward part of the hull. But this is in reality hardly an excessive quantity of armament, as the Baneblade is expected to fight on battlefields dominated by Titans and other super heavy formations. The Baneblade is expected to be the tip of the heavy armoured spearhead of the Imperial Guard, able to pierce through and crush anything the enemies of humanity can throw against it, and they can throw quite a lot. Yet, like a cliff in the storm, the Baneblade is expected to withstand it all, whilst pumping out a truly ferocious quantity of punishment in return. More than enough to dissuade any but the most determined and overwhelming infantry or armoured assaults. As the Baneblade's offensive weapons package is both powerful and versatile, starting with the aptly named Mega Battle Cannon. Because, well, it is in essence simply a much larger and more advanced variant of the standard Lehman Russ battle cannon. The Mega variant carried on the Baneblade is significantly larger, however, and a full 10 meters long. And considering the munitions it fires, it probably needs every meter. Now, it is not stated anywhere, as far as I'm aware, what the precise size of a Mega Battle Cannon is, but there are various mentions of it. We know, for example, that each individual shell is a meter long. There is also mentions that apparently guardsmen can put their heads down the barrel of these things. If that is true, then, well, the average human head is something along the lines of 55 centimeters wide, or 22 inches, meaning that this weapon would have to be in excess of 550 millimeters. That would make it larger than the main battery weapons mounted on the Yamato. And if we slap on just a little bit more, another 50 millimeters to the head estimate, a rounding error at this point, we're hitting the levels of the Karl Mercer, the 600 millimeters super heavy siege mortar. Now, we are beginning to enter the realms of impossibility here, but we're not actually quite there. A 10-meter long barrel mounted on a 300 tons vehicle. It is entirely within the realms of possibilities that it could carry a weapon of this size. At which point, well, we've long since left behind the usual rules of tank warfare, as a weapon like this would not penetrate an armored vehicle. It would, turn it into a magic trick. You know the one. The now you see it, pang, and now you don't. As anything smaller than another Baneblade is likely to be atomized by the impact alone. Never mind the 1/4 of a ton of high explosives. Oh, and before we forget ourselves, the Mega Battle Cannon is only one of the Baneblade's 2 primary weapons, as the hull-mounted Demolisher Cannon is just as large as the Mega Battle Cannon. Which means that if our math is roughly correct, a single Baneblade has the equivalent firepower to 2 super heavy siege mortars. Now that is actually a bit of ridiculous overkill. You might also then be wondering why one of them has a 10-meter long barrel. Why wouldn't you simply just mount a second Demolisher Cannon in the turret? Well, there is a reason for that, as the 2 weapons likely have 2 very different purposes. The hull-mounted Demolisher Cannon is, well, simply that, a Demolisher Cannon. An enormous gun that fires a big, fat, squat, non-armor penetrating warhead, maximizing HE filling, whilst more or less ignoring armor penetrating capabilities. This in turn means that the shell doesn't need to worry about velocity, which is something a long barrel, of course, can help you achieve. Meanwhile, the Mega Battle Cannon is clearly designed to be far more versatile, able to engage both infantry, no doubt, but also enemy armored threats, and presumably enemy armored threats of a similar level to the Baneblade. So, to fully explain the difference between the 2 and the reason behind this, we need a quick history lesson here. Back during the countless wars on ancient Terra, one of them, a world war, had started with the relatively recent invention of armored fighting vehicles. At the beginning of the war, it was assumed that these armored fighting vehicles would do one out of 2 things. Either they would fight against enemy infantry, or they would fight against enemy armored vehicles. It was seen as somewhat pointless and wasteful to have a vehicle that could do both things equally good, as surely specialization was superior. This was because the requirements for an armor-penetrating shell and for a high-explosive shell were different. For a high-explosive shell, again, it's very simple. All you need to do is have a shell as large as possible that you can fit as much high-explosive filler in as possible, and that's it. So long as it could be successfully, fired from the barrel, then that was all you really needed to worry about. And this, by and large, remains true all the way into the far-flung future of our 41st millennium. Similarly, the problems with armor-piercing weaponry was a far more complex one, because if you simply fired a large HE warhead at a tank, well, the overwhelming majority of that explosive force would not actually strike the tank's armor, as when it explodes, of course, in a 360-degree sphere of force, most of it will go other places, rather than directly into the target. So, even if you had a very large explosion, if only a fraction of it actually struck, it was mostly wasted. What you wanted instead was a tremendous amount of force delivered in a very small area. And elemental physics tells us how best to do so. Mass plus velocity equals force. In other words, You want as heavy and as dense a projectile as possible, fired at as high a speed as possible. And so long as you're doing this through a barrel, well, you're using the explosive gases and forces of the shell's detonation to push the actual weapon out of the barrel. Thus, the further it can travel, the more confined the gases will be, the more velocity and force they will impart on the shell. Simply put, longer barrel means higher velocity. Higher velocity means better armor penetrating capabilities. But a long barrel also introduces problems, which is why you wouldn't simply want a second mega battle cannon in the hull of the Baneblade. First and foremost, a very long barrel means that you have a tremendous amount of weight stretched out along a very long barrel. You've got loads and loads of steel hanging suspended in the air. Even the most advanced metallurgy will only be able to put up with that kind of strain for so long before the barrel begins to bend. And not to mention, of course, the incremental weaknesses introduced into the barrel by repeated firings of, 500-600 millimeters large warheads. It's also just really goddamn hard to make guns that big and that long, which is one of the reasons why most knockoff Baneblade tanks, the non-standard template construct variants produced by many Forge Worlds who would like the prestige of producing Baneblades but doesn't quite have the technology to do so, usually switch out the Mega Battle Cannon for something like a regular Lehman Russ Battle Cannon, or even 2 or 4, as on certain variants like the Stormhammer. But to return to the topic of the Mega Battle Cannon, as we are not quite done just yet, it also has a wide variety of specialized munition, all of which is custom made for use with the Mega Battle Cannon. Obviously, it's going to have more conventional weapons, high explosive shells, no doubt, or simpler armor-piercing weapons, like capped ballistic shells. Considering the sheer size of the rounds, I also imagine that a squash head would be absolutely ungodly, frankly, and probably more than enough to simply just turn most tanks inside out. Incidentally, for those who don't know, a high-explosive squash head is a form of anti-tank munition where you have a very soft head, thus the squash head, that is designed to squash upon impact, but behind and inside the shell is an enormous quantity of high explosives. As we mentioned earlier, with a simple high-explosive shell, the problem is that the explosion will go everywhere. And so what a squash head does is use the soft tip of the warhead to form a seal against the armored vehicle, so that when the high explosives detonates, all of the force, as much as practical, will be directed forward rather than outwards. Now, normally, this is designed to cause spalling inside of a tank. Spalling, by the way, is the phenomenon where an armored plate is hit with tremendous force, but not penetrated. Yet all of that kinetic energy is still transferred through the armored plating, causing the back part of it to splinter and crack. And these cracks can then break off pieces of armor, which will then shoot into the tank, as all of the kinetic energy of the explosion will be transferred into those shards. But in the case of a 500 to 600 millimeter squash head, I feel as if it'll cause a bit more than spalling, honestly. But considering the armament of some of the things it's going to be fighting, other super heavies or even titans, they might need something even more penetrative. And now we begin talking about kinetic energy penetrators. When you simply, ignore all of that nonsense like high explosives or squash heads or heat rounds, and instead say to yourself, well, mass plus velocity equals dead enemy. And thus, super heavy armor piercing shots is likely to be just that, super heavy armor piercing shots, with the main weapon being a ultra-dense material, fired from the tank's gun at the highest velocity possible, probably with a significantly larger explosive charge in the initial firing, sending the weapon flying out at thousands of meters per second, before striking its target and exerting maximum force and maximum density against the smallest area possible. Which in the case of, again, a 500 to 600 millimeters rounds is still going to be a significant surface area, but still. Though I imagine, honestly, that the majority of Baneblade munition, beyond a handful of extremely rare and precious super heavy armor-piercing weapons, or even guided munitions, as those do exist as well, though they are absurdly rare, is probably going to be simple high-explosive anti-tank ammunition, using some form of a shaped charge, as, after being fired from the barrel, the mega battle cannon rounds ignites a rocket engine to drive it forward. Now, to be entirely honest with you, this is one of at least 2 points, where 40k rubs up against reality in the wrong ways, because, well, here's the thing. You're actually going to get a hell of a lot higher velocity from simply firing a projectile out of a barrel than you are going to get from a rocket-propelled projectile. Now, of course, it's always possible that in the far-flung future, we've simply come up with some sort of rocket propulsion that could drive a projectile at a higher speed than firing it from a 10-meter-long barrel with an enormous propellant charge, but, well, as normally, rocket-propelled projectiles are considered to be pretty damn slow, actually. Now, the reason why you would want a rocket-assisted projectile, or RAP, is to increase range. And considering the size of the shell we're talking about here, that could be far more useful. As of course, a projectile of that size would usually be designed to be lobbed rather than fired directly. Though, incidentally, the Mega Battle Cannon is capable of a rather impressive 28 degrees of elevation, which means it could probably lob something a fair bit of a distance as well. Which might be fortunate, as Baneblades can also carry significantly more esoteric ammunition. Esoteric as in, Commander, why are the shells screaming? And the Baneblade commander would then simply just calmly turn around and stare the fresh-faced new loader straight into his eyes and say, "Why wouldn't the ammunition be screaming? If you knew what the ammunition was, you'd be screaming too." That sort of esoteric ammunition. It's, almost a relief to be in the secondary weaponry slots rather than the main weapon one, as you might be asked to operate a few things that'll shrivel up your life and your soul, quite possibly. And speaking of secondaries, the average Baneblade will carry 3 twin-linked heavy bolters for a total of 6 heavy bolters, 2 single-barreled autocannons, and 2 single-barreled las cannons. That is, incidentally, about the same firepower as another 3-odd tanks. But after having heard what the main weaponry looks like, I'm starting to wonder if the sponson mounts are ever really truly useful. Ever. Though, to be fair, the issue with carrying such an enormous gun is, of course, that it has enormous ammunition. The Baneblade only carries about 22 rounds for the Mega Battle Cannon, and another 18 for the hull-mounted Demolisher. And again, considering the sheer size of these things, I have no earthly idea how they resupply the Baneblade with them. I am presuming there is a very large hatch somewhere, and I am assuming there is a very long, complicated, and difficult process through which the enormous shells are loaded into the tank. Not something you wish to try during active combat. Meaning that, usually, the Baneblade will probably want to try and kill whatever it's trying to murder with one of its secondary weapons before using the Mega Battle Cannon on it. And this is one of the weaknesses of the Baneblade. It has a very limited ammunition capacity. It's also listed to carry about 300 rounds of autocannon and 4,000 rounds of heavy bolter shells, which I presume at the very least is per weapon, because if it isn't, it's carrying very, very little ammo, especially for the heavy bolter sponsors, but details. And if a Baneblade needs to disengage from the front line to rearm, well, its max speed on a paved surface is 25 kilometers per hour. I shudder to think what that might be in reverse, or on a less than ideal surface. In all due likelihood, should a Baneblade find itself in a position where it needs to reverse out of the battlefield to keep its strongest frontal armor facing against the enemy, it's probably going to do so at a torturously slow 10 to 15 kilometers per hour. Oh yes. Despite its incredible weaponry and formidable defenses, the Baneblade is vulnerable to simply just being overwhelmed, and requires significant support to make sure that this doesn't happen, preferably by nearby armoured regiments and mechanized infantry, allowing it to retreat to a safe distance to rearm and ready itself for the next confrontation. A single Baneblade is a vulnerable Baneblade, especially as, well, here we arrive at problematic point number 2. The Baneblade's armor protection is listed as being 200mm thick, with a 220mm thick turret. Furthermore, we are informed that this protection is rolled homogeneous steel armor. And I know a fair few of you are currently shaking their heads right about now, as yes, this is one of those occasions where the Games Workshop staff member who wrote all of this out doesn't really have much in the way of understanding of actual military weaponry, or the history of warfare, as 200mm of armor in a modern conflict is, dick all. Really, as even during the Second World Kerfuffle, we developed armor-piercing weaponry with penetration in excess of 250mm. Let's not even get started on modern-day heat weaponry, with penetration in excess of 800 to 900mm. The Baneblade, as far as its armor protection is concerned, has virtually none. And we know that the Imperium has shaped charges. That's what a crack grenade is. Not to mention melter guns. So, strictly speaking, from a 40k lore perspective, the Baneblade, ultra super heavy, mega heavy tank thing, can be reliably penetrated by man-portable anti-tank weaponry. Frontally penetrated by man-portable anti-tank weaponry. Yeah. So for the sake of the integrity of the 41st millennium, we are going to assume that this isn't actually, as GW once stated, rolled homogeneous steel armor. Instead, it's probably some sort of compound. It's ceramite or plasteel or something. And actually, it's incredibly resistant to the shaped charge effect. The jet of molten metal actually just splatters aside on its hull. Magic. As in reality, of course, there are plenty of ways to defeat even-shaped charges. Now, most of them are intended to actually stop the jet of metal from touching the hull to begin with, either via explosive reactive armor or via spaced armor. Now, spaced armor, the 41st millennium does have, but as for era, well, the Imperium of Man never invented that, apparently. Still, even if we assume that the Baneblade is made of significantly tougher stuff than simply just rolled steel armor, the weakness of the Baneblade remains the same. Its inability to maneuver, well, I was about to say quickly, at all, in essence, as this will make it very vulnerable to infantry or large numbers of enemy armored vehicles. In a universe where things like melters and crack grenades do indeed exist, it would be quite simple to get around a Baneblade and perhaps climb on top of it. Most Baneblades is going to have some sort of pintle-mounted cupola weapon, maybe a heavy stubber or a storm bolter or something, so it's hardly defenseless from boarders. Many will also have some basic gun ports around the main turret too. But still, if infantry manage to get on top of the tank, the hatches are unlikely to be anywhere near as thick as the main armor, and can definitely be breached. Melter weapons fired at the flank or rear with its enormous power plant could also be crippling, and potentially outright devastating. And with the Baneblade being so big a target, it's going to have a very hard time hiding from large packs of hunter-killer enemy armor either. To avoid this, a Baneblade is best deployed with ample support. As terrifying though the vehicle might be, it also represents an enormous commitment of resources and priceless technology. Each and every Baneblade is given a unique serial number, and their careers are tracked almost as closely as those of Titans. And whilst, of course, Baneblades are easier to replace than a full-on Titan, that doesn't say much. And so any regiment that has one in their possession is going to be very, very careful not to lose it. And there are, of course, multiple ways to do so without minimizing the efficiency of the tank. Now, in the 41st millennium, combined arms is a bit of a dirty word in certain regards, as most regiments are single-purpose regiments, or specialized if you wish to be charitable. Armored regiments, artillery regiments, infantry regiments, mechanized regiments, and so on. There are often regiments that will have elements of other forces, like an infantry regiment may have a couple of armored vehicles attached to them, a mechanized regiment might have a few tanks, and artillery regiments might have some infantry to act as forward spotters or light armored elements like salamanders. In the case of super heavy regiments, considering the incredible value of these vehicles, it is far from uncommon for them to have some dedicated support elements, be it mechanized infantry or salamander-born scouts. But simultaneously, the Imperial Guard tends to be very careful about this, because the entire reason why the Imperial Guard is so heavily segmented and compartmentalized is precisely so that if one regiment goes rogue, there will be ample other regiments that can work together, employing combined arms tactics, to take it down. Thus, if you were to provide a super heavy tank regiment with all of the tools required, including infantry and maybe light armored support, well, you'd better equip them with a whole heck of a lot of commissars and ministorum priests as well to make doubly sure. Usually, the commander of the regiment will use whatever forces he has to guard the Baneblade. In extreme cases, this might be other Baneblades. There are patterns of Baneblades, like, for example, the Storm Hammer or the Hell Hammer variant, that would be better focused on dealing with enemy infantry. You might, for example, place the Baneblade in the forward position, poised to deal with enemy armor as a primary threat rating, with Hellhammer or Stormhammers at its flanks to deal with anything that gets past the Baneblade and or hordes of enemy foot troops. And considering the range and efficiency of these weaponry, on their flanks could easily mean half a kilometer or more to the rear of the leading Baneblade. Of course, on many an occasion, like urban warfare or attacking fortifications, this might not be an option. In these cases, the commander of the super heavy regiment will seek out other guard formations nearby and use them as direct support for the Baneblade. In an ideal scenario, the Baneblade will be escorted by formations of Imperial Guard foot troopers, close support infantry which will make sure that no enemy tank hunters will sneak up on them, or hide in rubble, for example. These infantry formations will advance well in front of the tank, clearing out entrenched enemy infantry and seeking out booby traps and enemy anti-tank mines, as even though a tank mine is unlikely to destroy a Baneblade, it could very easily detrack it. And considering it's a 300 tons vehicle, and it has tracks inside of its side guards, repairing a broken track is going to take a very long time, and probably a lot of specialized machinery as well. Furthermore, you would want heavier infantry elements, mechanized or motorized at least preferably, to provide close-in support and security, more expressly, to the Baneblade. A second-line formation to check over the ground and to intercept any enemies that the first line might have missed. The infantry will of course also be able to provide supplementary anti-tank abilities with man-portable weapons like rocket launchers or melters. But ideally, yet again, the Baneblade would be operating alongside Imperial armored elements too. Considering the extraordinary range of the Mega Battle Cannon's rocket-assisted rounds, the Baneblade should be sitting back at a nice and safe distance, destroying hardened targets and enemy armor well outside of the effective range of any counter-fire. It could essentially provide Overwatch support to advancing Leman Russ battle tanks. Again, in certain scenarios, like invasions of urban areas, this is not going to be possible, but even in these close-in engagements, you'd much rather risk a Leman Russ than you would a Baneblade, giving them the not exactly enviable task of sweeping ahead of the Baneblade. The key here is, of course, to always balance out protecting the tank with actually employing it. You want to make sure it's safe, because replacing one is really not an option 9 times out of 10, but you also don't want to waste those enormous weapons of it either. And furthermore, one should absolutely not forget the psychological effect that a Baneblade might have upon the enemy. Once again, during the various worldwide kerfuffles of Terra's ancient history, a psychological phenomenon was observed in infantry formations that had to fight against tanks and armored vehicles. This was often given the catch-all term of tank shock. Untrained infantry in particular tended to respond exceptionally poorly, and might even in many cases outright break, run, or surrender when faced with an enemy that they could not damage. An understandable response. If you're sitting there in a trench with a bolt-action rifle and 50 tons worth of armored vehicle is rolling towards you, what are you supposed to do? Now, in reality, a well-trained and disciplined infantryman, even armed only with hand grenades or small arms, can pose a significant danger to armoured vehicles. This was something demonstrated again and again during the Second Great World Kerfuffle on the Eastern Front, where one side had a rather devastating advantage in armour, and yet the other side's infantry learned many remarkable ways to deal with that armoured advantage. And sadly, the enemies of humanity have only grown craftier ever since, with man-portable weaponry capable of cutting through even Baneblade armor, or enormous charges used to blow off belts, or blast open hatches, or simply disable the enormous engine power plant to the rear of the vehicle. Infantry remains a great threat to the heaviest armored vehicle. However, that is only if they have the discipline, the training, the weaponry, and the nerves of steel required to sit in a hole and wait as 300 tons of armor and weaponry trundle past you. To keep your nerve and wait for that one precise moment when there is a non-0% chance you could dart forward and deliver a blow, probably at the cost of your own life, to the armored behemoth. The majority of troops are not that brave, and a Baneblade is capable of delivering that sort of tank shock not just to the infantryman in his trench, but to enemy tanks as well. The bolt-action rifle might not be of much use against the Baneblade, but neither is most regular anti-tank weaponry either. If you're stuck in a Lehman Russ or some equivalent and you're going up against a Baneblade, your odds of survival are next to nil, as you could easily bounce round after round off its armor, whilst in turn being vaporized by a single shot. And even if, by some miracle, your tank is equipped with the kind of hyper-rare and specialized heavy penetration munition required to penetrate a Baneblade, well, most of those weapons are extreme density, high-speed velocity projectiles. And again, as we talked about previously, if you want extreme velocity, you need a small, focused, directed, and super hard projectile. In other words, you're not going to be putting a whole lot of high explosives inside of it, if any at all, meaning that you will rely near entirely on the kinetic force of the weapon to destroy the target, or more likely to kill its crew or parts of it, or spalling to do the job. And considering the Baneblade has 10 crew members, that is an exceptionally unlikely scenario. Knowing this, entire battlefronts have turned on the appearance of a single super heavy. Entire assaults have been broken, or have in turn broken the defender with the simple appearance of one of these ginormous weapons. And that's before we get to the even more demoralizing effect of having it actually shoot at you. Of seeing probably a few dozen meters of front line simply disappear in a cataclysmic explosion, to feel the ground shake underneath you, to be splattered in the rain of dirt kicked up by the weapon aerosolizing a good 10 square meters worth of ground. That's going to make anyone nervous. And as any good strategist and tactician knows, causing damage to the enemy's morale is just as, if indeed not, better than causing damage to their numbers. Of course, if you can do both at the same time, then that's no bad deal either. And the Baneblade is more than able to achieve both. When properly used and deployed, it can be one of the most devastating weapons on the battlefield, capable of turning the tide of large-scale conflict in the favor of the Imperium, both on the offensive and on the defensive. For the Baneblade can be as much the tip of the spear as it can also be an inviolable bunker, sitting at the heart of Imperial fortifications, dishing out punishment in all directions, being essentially a moving rallying point, an umbrella of protection and absolute destruction around which Imperial forces can gather and reorganize themselves for another stand or a counterattack. The Baneblade, despite its many limitations, speed in particular, can be a fairly versatile little critter, for the simple reason that blowing enormous holes in your enemy's front line, well, that is a capability with a broad range of applications. If only the Emperor's armies had a few more of these venerable war machines. But, unfortunately, yet unavoidably, the extreme complexity of their production and the fact that those few forge worlds with access to the standard template construct for the Baneblade guard their secrets ferociously means that they will always be in short supply. And to be fair, even if the information and knowledge was widely spread, the sheer competence and skill required to manufacture these war machines, the internal structure of the hull to prevent it from simply crushing itself underneath its own weight of armor, the mega battle cannon, or the enormous MR503 V8 multi-fuel power plant. Even just a single one of these ingredients would be challenging enough for any Forge world. To be able to manufacture all of them at the same time and make them play nice together, that is a challenge that is simply beyond most servants of the Adeptus Mechanicus in these dark days of the 41st millennium. That is hardly news, however. And so the Imperium is simply going to have to soldier on with those machines it has, taking the best possible care to preserve their enormous power for countless wars yet to come. And now, I shall bid you all adieu. Until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.